poetry. Yelling, angry, waving my hands a lot, specific point of view on things. Runaway bride, Julia Roberts, Julia Rob hurts.
Have you ever wanted to write a poem but felt intimidated by all the rules of rhyming and structure? Then free verse poetry is probably for you. This form is a type of poetry where the poet is free to write whatever and however they want. But don't mistake this for an easy way to write a poem. There's much more work to a free verse poem than you might think. So let's talk about free verse poems, the characteristics of a free verse poem, and how to write a free verse poem. But first, let's answer the question. A free verse poem is a type of poem that doesn't follow a set rhyme scheme or meter. Instead, a free verse poem relies on devices such as rhythm, word choice, and imagery to create a compelling poem. This freedom allows the poet to focus on the poem's content rather than the form. While there are no strict rules governing free verse poetry, many free verse poems have a distinct structure. For example, they often begin with a description of a scene or an object. This introduction is followed by a series of reflections on the scene or the object, which can help to create a deeper understanding of the poem's subject matter. Free verse poems can be any length and often use natural rhythms to create a pleasing flow of words. While free verse poems might appear simple, they can be very complex. The best free verse poems are those that strike a balance between form and content, using the characteristics of free verse to enhance the poem's meaning. With that said, let's review the characteristics of a free verse poem. Free verse poems do not follow any set pattern of rhyme or meter. The poet focuses on the poem's imagery and meaning rather than worrying about finding a perfect rhyme scheme. This type of poem relies on the cadence of words to create a sense of rhythm. Free verse poems often have a more personal tone. The lack of structure allows poets to focus on the expressive potential of language. Free verse poems can be highly creative and experimental. Free verse poems often employ imagery and figurative language to create vivid pictures in the reader's mind. Now that we know the characteristics of a free verse poem, let's discuss how to write a free verse poem in 6 simple steps. That's a good example of, what's it called? Alliteration, that's what it's called. One of the most critical choices a poet has to make is what to write about. After all, the subject of the poem can determine its entire mood and tone. Of course, there are no hard and fast rules when it comes to choosing a subject. Sometimes the best poems come from simply exploring the world around you and writing down whatever inspires you in the moment. However, if you're feeling stuck, it can help to brainstorm potential ideas and topics ahead of time. Here is a technique you can use to brainstorm a subject. I'm going to put it on the screen, and you feel free to pause this and write it down. Once you have some ideas on paper, you can start narrowing them down and choose the one that feels like the best fit. Trust your instincts and go with a subject that you are passionate about. Step 2, create a mind map, free write, or list. Now that you have a subject, you need to decide what you want to say about it. In other words, determine what you want to be the theme or lesson of your poem. Again, we can fall back on a few different brainstorming techniques to determine what we want to say about our subject. I'm going to list 3, but you only need to use one of these to discover the theme of your poem. In my video on how to write a traditional poem, I talked about a technique called mind mapping and how to use that in your brainstorming. If you want to check out that video, I'll link it in the comments, or a link should pop up somewhere around my head. But let's talk about free writing. In free writing, all you need to do is write everything that comes to mind about your subject. Write in complete sentences. You can even separate your writing into paragraphs if you want, but that's not really required. For this technique, I would set a timer to create some sort of sense of urgency, just so that you're not sitting around free writing all day long. Don't analyze or filter your thoughts as you write. Let them flow directly onto the paper. Don't stress about what you're writing. It's just brainstorming. Unless your free writing ends up looking like this.
How do you like it?
In that case, get help quickly. When you have finished, read your paper, look for ideas and themes, and ignore anything that feels off topic. Don't mistake this free writing for a finished product though. The results of your free writing are probably too raw and disorganized to stand as a completed poem. But let's talk about listing. So for listing, you're gonna sit down with a notepad and a piece of paper. Write your subject at the top of the notepad and then number your paper to 10 or 20. Probably just 10, 20 seems like a little bit of an overkill. Just write the numbers down the margin of your paper like you're taking a spelling test. You can go beyond 20 if you like, but I wouldn't. Write a list of 20 ideas Write a list of 10 or 20 ideas, phrases, or words that come to your mind when you think of the subject. Try to write quickly with as few pauses as possible and stop when you get to the bottom of your list. Now review. Again, you're looking for connecting ideas or an overall theme that might have emerged. Once you've finished brainstorming, you can begin to think about the structure of your poem, which leads us to step 3, plan your structure. When we talked about writing a classic poem, we used an extended metaphor to create our structure. For a free verse poem, it is helpful to structure your writing as a narrative. Think of this poem as a slice of life. As we've said before, free verse poetry often has a personal tone. You can structure this poem as a personal narrative. Choose a moment in your life that relates to your chosen subject. In your poem, you're going to describe that moment from its natural starting point to a natural conclusion. As you structure the poem, think about ways you can illustrate the theme. An example of this technique is that you may want to write about a relationship you've had in your life. Describe that relationship from its beginning and to its end, or if it hasn't ended, you can talk about how it's evolved over time. If you found this video helpful so far, don't forget to like it and subscribe to our channel for more writing tips and help. Step 4, experiment with figurative language. Free verse poems are often thought of as free from the restraints of traditional poetic forms, but I recommend you use some figurative language. Figurative language can help add depth and richness to your words. Simile, metaphor, and personification are potent tools that can create vivid images and convey complex ideas. So don't be afraid to experiment with figurative language in your free verse poems. It might be the key taking your work to the next level. Let's discuss one type of figurative language that you may not have heard of. It's called enjambment. There's a B in the middle of that word that's really throwing me for a loop. Enjambment is when a poet continues an idea beyond a natural pause like a line break or a break between stanzas. Here's an example from John Keats' poem Endymion. A thing of beauty is a joy forever. Its loveliness increases. It will never pass into nothingness. Enjambment creates a sense of movement or momentum in a poem, and it can be used to develop a surprise or juxtaposition within a poem. Whatever technique you choose, make sure that it highlights the theme of your poem. I'll link an article in the comments that goes into more detail on figurative language and how to use it. Step 5 is to write your first draft. Writing the first draft of a free verse poem can be a liberating experience. With free verse poems, there are no rules to follow in terms of rhyme or meter, and this means that you can focus on expressing your thoughts and feelings without worrying about whether or not they fit into a specific format. In addition, free verse poems often have a more natural flow than poems that adhere to strict conventions. As you write your first draft, don't be afraid to experiment with different wording and images. The important thing is to capture your authentic voice on the page. So what do you want to write about? Like we talked about in the brainstorming phase, I want you to tell your personal story. Use imagery and figurative language to add a poetic flourish, and use your story to teach a lesson or create a theme. And here's the thing about a poem. It doesn't have to be something deep or traumatic or dramatic or whatever you think it might need to be. The only thing that matters is that your story is important to you. So don't stress, just write. Step 6 is to proofread and edit. When you're done with your first draft, there are a few things that you need to do. First, read the poem aloud to yourself. This process can help you catch any errors in grammar or punctuation, as well as any awkward phrasing. If possible, have someone else read the poem out loud to you. Next, take a look at the overall structure of the poem. Is it balanced or does it seem lopsided? Are there any parts that feel excessive or out of place? Rearrange and cut lines to improve the poem's flow. You can also pay attention to how the poem looks on the page. What is its shape? Things like that matter. Finally, focus on the individual words and phrases used. Are there any places where a different word might create a more powerful image or emotion? Is there anything that you can do to make the language more concise or impactful? When you feel comfortable with your work, share it with your family or friends and ask for suggestions and feedback.
How do you like it?
Have an open mind when you're listening to critiques. Hopefully by now you're halfway through organizing your first free verse poem, because that's all I have to say on the subject. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like and subscribe and to share it. But until next time, keep writing, and later skaters.